Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vint Cerf. I'm Google's chief internet evangelist. I did sit for a couple of years on the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel Governing Board. And apart from that, I've plugged a lot of appliances in and out of sockets, and so that's about as much as I know about electricity. But we're here this afternoon to talk more about networking and electricity. I have a very distinguished panel to my left and to your right, whom I will introduce momentarily. First of all, though, I want to give you a sense for what we're going to try to accomplish in this session. We run all the way until 4 o'clock. The content of the session will be dictated in two ways. One, panelists will begin with some opening remarks that will be relatively brief. We'll have discussions among ourselves for a while, and after that battle settles down, I'd like to invite all of you to interact with the panel and with each other. You have a couple of ways to do this. There's a Twitter feed, which is supposed to be available to you. You can send questions that way, or there will be microphones available towards the front here. You can stand up and ask questions. Let me warn you about that little piece of logistics. Actually, I see the microphones are further back, about midway. I'm hearing impaired, and so I'm going to be the guy that came to talk and wouldn't listen. The consequence of this is not that you shouldn't ask questions, but rather that if you ask a question and I can't hear it, my panelists who can hear will be helping me figure out which of them can answer the question. Of course, if the question doesn't make any sense, we can't do anything about that, so that's your problem. I want to emphasize that there are a number of ways in which networking and electrical power generation and distribution can be related to each other. I think there are three general ways in which we could see this interaction. One of them, pretty obvious, is that the control of the generation and distribution of power takes advantage of computing and networking and modeling and sensing. And so the control system is a network. And of course, we're increasingly introducing more sophisticated kinds of networking in order to manage the SCADA system that handles the distribution and generation of power. One thing that I consider to be a major issue has to do with the likelihood that power generation will become more distributed. Historically, we've had centralized power generation, distribution through the systems, and interconnection of those centralized systems. However, as we see things like solar panels, wind power, electric cars that can either absorb or even dump energy into the system, we have a much more distributed environment. And here, stability of control, freshness of state information, and the like raises a lot of questions about stable control and what we do to maintain such stability. So that's one aspect of power generation and distribution which introduces networking. The second thing is the user access to controls of and automatic management of power consumption and power generation. We see increasingly the possibility of residential systems having consuming devices, energy-consuming devices, that are capable of communicating both their needs and their uses, and also of hearing that there's a change, for example, in the charging rate for power because of a peak load. So this sort of demand-response notion suggests that these smarter pieces of equipment need to communicate and will, in fact, be programmable to respond to advice about what's happening in the power generation and distribution system. This gets even more complicated when we have local power generation, backup generators, and things like that. You could imagine deciding, for economic reasons, that if the pricing per kilowatt hour gets up above a certain dimension, that you want to kick in your backup generator because it's cheaper. Now, I don't know how many people would end up doing that, but you can imagine the complexity of a system that has this kind of popping in and out of power sources. So the user control is a big issue. Access control is a big issue. If you have a lot of power-consuming devices that are networked and which could be managed either by individuals through their mobiles or through third-party environmental control services that say, tell us about all of your energy-consuming equipment, we will manage this to a certain profile for you. You now have this question of who can get access to those devices and turn them off and on. Now you get worried about the possibility of penetration of control. Turning 10 million air conditioners off and on in some synchronized way could cause a lot of damage to the power generation and distribution system. Now I have to log in again. What a pain in the neck. Who is it that invented these things anyway? Okay. So that's the next thing, is access control and authorization to manage these devices. The third thing is the gathering and analysis of information about power generation and consumption. Feedback to the consumers or to businesses about their way of using power, what choices they've made, either in lifestyle or business operation procedures, that reflects on the cost of power and the amount that they have to use. So this gathering of information, this sensing of information is, again, a very important element in our discussion this afternoon. There's a kind of subtext to all of this which may or may not turn up in our discussion, but I'll put it on the table as a reminder. Some people are looking at networks that we use, like the ones at Google or Amazon or Microsoft and so on, as power-consuming systems that are using an increasing amount of power. These are very large-scale data centers. Some of them require hundreds of megawatts of backup power. So the question is, should we be thinking about how computer networks themselves and all the devices that make use of them, including our mobiles, laptops, and so on, consume power, and should we care about that and the efficiency of those systems? So that's sort of just a brief introduction to what I think we're going to be talking about this afternoon. I want to introduce all of our panelists, and then I will invite them to come up one by one to give their early framing remarks, and then we'll get into our conversation. So let me start out with Shankar Sastry, who is just there to my left. He is the Dean of Engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He has a BS in technology from the Indian Institute of Technology, and MS in, is it Electrical Engineering and Computer Science? That's what EESCS stands for. From Berkeley, an MA in Mathematics from Berkeley, and a PhD in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, again from University of California, Berkeley. He has held academic posts at MIT and Berkeley. He was the director of the Information Technology Office at DARPA. He served on the Defense Science Board. He served on the President's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology. He served on the DIA NRC panels on emerging threats and continues to serve on that panel. He's served on the Naval Research Advisory Council. He's written over 400 papers. He's a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering. He's a fellow of the IEEE, and he got the President of India Gold Medal, among many other awards. So, I mean, this is a heavyweight on our panel. It turns out everybody else is incredibly equally well qualified. So the next person who is on the panel, Shwetak Patel, is an assistant professor in both the departments of Computer Science and Engineering and Electrical Engineering at the University of Wisconsin. He was the founder of a company called Zensi, which is a demand-side energy monitoring solutions provider. It was acquired by Belkin in 2010. He got his PhD in computer science from the Georgia Institute of Technology, a BS in computer science there earlier. He received the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship just last year in 2011, and the TR-35 Award in 2009 from MIT. This is the technology researcher under the age of 35. He was named the top innovator of the year by the Seattle Business Magazine. He was named Newsmaker of the Year by the Seattle Business Journal, the recipient of the Microsoft Research Faculty Fellowship last year, and honored by the New York Times as a top technologist in 2005. So I've heard this guy speak. You're going to love this. He's just full of more energy than any 100 megawatt power generator could demonstrate. The next speaker is G. Rittenhouse, and he has another distinguished biography. He is the vice president of Bell Labs Research. He oversees all of the Bell Labs research centers and research activities, and before this, he was at Bell Labs Technology Integration Group, and before that, he headed up the technology. Before he headed up technology integration, he was vice president of Bell Labs Wireless Research. Now, G, I realize as I look at this that I somehow missed the Alcatel-Lucent activity in France. So if you want to make a comment about this, you're welcome to do so during your opening remarks. He has a bachelor's degree in physics from UCLA, an electrical engineering, a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT. He received the Bell Labs Fellow Award in 2002, numerous publications and patents in the area of communications and circuits. So we welcome him to the panel. Finally, Anita Jones, to my far left, an incredible story here. She got her PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon in 1970. I shouldn't say when. It was sometime in the previous century. She left CMU as an associate professor when she founded Tartan Laboratories. She was vice president of Tartan. Then she came to the University of Virginia as a professor and chair of the computer science department. Then she escaped academia for a period of about 4 years when she served as the first woman in the position of Director of Defense Research and Engineering in the Clinton administration. And we all cheered when that happened. For two reasons. First of all, she broke the gender barrier, but second, she did a bang-up job in that job. She received the Air Force Meritorious Civilian Service Award, Distinguished Public Service Award, Tribute in the Congressional Record. She was vice chair of the National Science Board, a member of the Defense Science Board, and co-chair of the Virginia Research and Technology Advisory Commission. She's a member of the Charles Stark Draper Laboratory Corporation. She's a member of the National Research Council, Advisory Council for Policy and Global Affairs. She's an ACM Fellow, an IEEE Fellow, author of all kinds of papers and 2 books. So we welcome Anita also to this panel. So I will stop with all the introductory remarks, which look like they took about 15 minutes. I apologize if it took that long. And I would now like to ask Shankar Sastry to come up and lay out for you some of his thoughts in this realm of networking and power generation and distribution. You want to speak? You can speak from your seat if you like. Not a problem.
Thank you very much. It's been a high-energy morning here, so we'll do our best to keep up the energy of the morning. I just wanted to talk about a few things about the lay of the land, the way I see it in terms of information and energy. Gadgets in computers, servers, all of those, they're a small but growing part of the energy consumption. But in addition, I think that they have a very important role, and they're beginning to play an even more important role in lots of energy efficiency technologies as well as smart grid technologies. Let me just give you 2 examples of some really significant kinds of new projects that I've seen on the horizon. First is buildings. And that was certainly a subject of a lot of discussion this morning, and President Clinton also runs this commission for getting corporate America to reduce the amount of energy consumption. In the United States, about 40% of the energy that's consumed is in buildings. It's a little higher in places in Nordic countries or in small countries like Singapore. And the question arises as to whether through persistent monitoring of the HVAC, of the lighting, of other plug loads, whether it is possible to make a severe dent, a serious enough dent in the level of energy consumption. So, for instance, the United States, 40% is in buildings, 25% is in transportation, and roughly the rest is in industry. So it's our feeling that really, even after you take into account better insulation materials, better windows, better architecture, those kinds of improvements can probably result in about it can result in a 20% or a 25%, if you do it at a stretch, savings in the energy consumption of a building.
Can I ask you whether that means 25% of the 40% or
25% of the 40%?
Okay, so that's 10% net. All right,
that's 10% net.
Okay.
On the other hand, we have now begun to start doing experiments in many places, in Denmark, in Singapore, and in California. Denmark and Singapore are places with real weather, unlike California. But to try to see if you can reduce the energy consumption even further. And to give you a sense, we believe that with really quite modest investments, and certainly investments in instrumentation, and also methods for giving people incentives, and I'll talk a little bit about incentives as well, to reduce their energy consumption, we could bring energy consumption down by 50% in California possibly by as much as 60 or 75% in Singapore. In fact, in Singapore, the building authority has set itself a goal of getting 60 to 75% on retrofits for existing buildings and 80 to 90% reduction in the energy consumption on new stock, new building stock. In places like Denmark, they too think that 60% is a stretch goal, but they'd certainly be able to go over 50%. So what does this consist of? This consists of having wireless sensor networks for measuring temperature, humidity, other kinds of factors, and then being able to turn on and off devices, HVAC devices, possibly refrigeration, possibly other kinds of plug loads, so as to be able to control microclimates, so as to be able to control the quality of the air in a building. And in fact, one can show that really one can do this without adversely affecting how buildings feel. You know, there's a lot of important work to be done in terms of making sure that when you do energy efficient solutions, that buildings continue to be livable. You know, some buildings are just nice to be in and others are not as nice. And this actually is a subject of a fair amount of science, and you can maintain this quality but still produce these. So that's an example of where a lot of this wireless activity, a lot of computing. There is DOE2, which comes out of LBL, which is a huge it's a huge energy simulation system for buildings, which needs to be customized. And so it's this beautiful interplay between distributed sensing, swarms of sensors, the cloud, which does computing, intermediated by smart devices that can actually result in building energy consumption. Another one is a project that two of my colleagues are working on, David Culler and Randy Katz, and they posited this question of why can the smart grid not look more like the internet? Why does it have to look the way it does, even though it has been built for legacy purposes in a certain way, for a certain level of reliability? And the first question, of course, that pops to mind is that you need distributed storage if it is to act like the internet. But as you heard this morning, and as you've heard repeatedly through this conference, you know, distributed storage and batteries, which can go through many thousands of charge-discharge cycles, are really making progress. So this question of how you manage distributed consumption and distributed generation, whether we call it demand response, smart grid, all of those, I think gives us a new chance for architecting the smart grid based on the experiences of the internet, which people like Vint are, of course, pioneered in bringing to all of us. So I think these are two examples of really pretty, and these are all things where Siemens and ABB and General Electric, they've all jumped in, so this is not just stuff that's happening in ivy-clad walls. One thing that I've been especially interested in is privacy and security, and certainly privacy is a pretty important thing, and I think Anita is going to talk a little bit about this. I won't. I'll sort of temporarily not talk about this. But cybersecurity is getting to be a pretty important area. And in a lot of ways, it's not unlike in the financial sector. It starts off from the desire to bleed off free power and not pay for it. But then that gets mixed up with the nexus of organized crime, and then there's organized attacks. And it's really this, what you can do to secure the network is really quite non-trivial, and it involves not only sort of traditional computer security, but really it's computer security interacting with a cyber-physical system, which is really a physical infrastructure, a power infrastructure, a telecom infrastructure, gas infrastructures, water infrastructures, all of which are controlled by electronic means. You know, you've probably all seen pictures of it was a Siemens ad, I think, in The Economist, of somebody sitting on a mountaintop and controlling a nuclear power plant. And of course, you can imagine that all of this really comes with some vulnerabilities. So you have to come up with taxonomies of attack, taxonomies of defenses, and really, you know, the word crash for these systems is more than a metaphor for what can go on. So I think that there's some extra things that one needs to pay attention with. And related to that is this question of economic incentives. I think that in the case of the power infrastructure, like a lot of other infrastructures, a lot of the infrastructure is privately owned. Vint's colleague and my former colleague, Hal Varian, proved a theorem under very, very general conditions that said that if you have a number of distributed entities who are all operating in that common good, so the economists, Hal Varian's economist, so his economist language, the Nash equilibrium associated with these distributed decision makers canonically results in an underinvestment in the common good. You see this in network congestion, you see this in roads, you see this in cybersecurity. So the question that an economist or we ask ourselves is, how do you provide economic incentives in the form of lotteries, in the form of prices, in the form of peer pressure, in the form of other ways of getting people, distributed decision makers, to invest in the common good? And here, I have to say, philosophically, it's our contention, I think, that most of the technologists would line up. I mean, it's not an ideological consideration. It's far better to provide incentives than have the heavy hand of regulation to get people to invest in doing the right thing. So all of this provides really a wonderful landscape of new techniques for dealing with smart grid, with energy efficiency technologies, but also distributed demand response systems.
Thank you. That's remarkably thought-provoking, especially that last part about the Nash equilibrium not producing an optimum result. Well, you mentioned that we would need to gather quite a bit of information in order to understand what's going on in the system and manage it. And the man who can tell us the way to do that is Shwetak Patel. So go for it.
Thanks, Vint. So what I want to talk a little bit about is, so one of the points of this panel is how the IT revolution is not only informing what we're trying to do in the energy space, but also how can we use that and leverage that IT revolution in energy. And I think this is an incredibly interesting space, just how what Bill Gates said when he gave the keynote was, the IT revolution was just something that came on really quick. And how can the energy space actually keep up? And it turns out that it may not be able to do that. But why not piggyback on the IT revolution and what we're seeing right now? I think we're in an incredibly exciting period where we have a lot of really interesting things that are happening on the IT side that's actually going to be a nice catalyst for the energy space. So I want to talk a little bit about that. First I want to mention is, computer science in general is going to have a huge impact in energy. We've seen a lot of work from, mechanical engineering, chemistry, a lot of really innovative work. In a lot of different spaces, and we've heard a lot of work in terms of simulation. We're leveraging a lot of high-performance computing in terms of being able to model these things that aren't really possible. But it turns out there's a lot of different aspects of computing that we can leverage. Data collection, the network itself, storage, machine learning, the inferencing techniques that we learn in computing are going to play a huge role in solving a lot of these challenges. Sensing technology. I think the IT revolution has really changed the way that we gather, consume, and present information, and we need to be able to embrace that and take advantage of that. So I'll talk about three ideas that I think which are critical that we should explore and are exploring in this space. I can go on forever as being an academic, but I'll limit myself to 3 items. The first is new approaches to kind of empower the consumer. So when I mean consumer, I mean the person that's trying to monitor their energy at home. I think it really starts at the house or at home, because it's not until they start to understand the mental models at home that they really start to, really understand what they could do in the workplace or outside of the home. And I think right now there's a big disconnect in terms of people's notion of how energy is even consumed, how it's generated, and what they can really do to reduce their consumption. So Anita will talk a little bit about the energy, kind of interfaces and HCI questions, so the human-computer interaction questions around it. I'll mainly talk about kind of, the need for sensing technology in the home that give people a better idea of where they're using their energy. So there's been a significant amount of work in disaggregation, itemization, using sensors to give you a better idea of where every kilowatt is going or every watt is going. And how can you present that information back in more actionable ways that really empower and really change the mental model of energy for consumers. And I think there's a lot of interesting work here, and I think there's going to continue to be a lot of work in energy disaggregation and being able to use computer science to give you that really high resolution information. And I think there's a number of stakeholders that can benefit, not just the consumers, but appliance manufacturers will have better ideas on how their appliances are used, but also policymakers and others will leverage this information that we actually have very little idea about how people use their energy in the home. I think a lot of it's just self-report, and everybody knows how inaccurate self-report is. The second is the networking and storage infrastructure that has really enable the IT revolution is something that we definitely need to piggyback on. Netflix and other services and even uploading capabilities have really changed in the last couple of years. And how can we leverage that to provide out-of-band network interfaces for smart meters and other sensors so we don't have to tax the power line interface for communication or AMR system, but use the out-of-band service, which is the network itself, to send this data back to centers that are doing analysis on it, or basically to portals that allow you to render this information in more effective ways. So if Netflix can do it, why can't we do it in the energy space? And so I think we need to start to look at a variety of different wins that we've already seen in the IT revolution to see what we can do to parallel that. I think one interesting area of research that people have been working on is in the health space. The health community are facing the same issues. You have a significant amount of sensor data that's going to be going back up. The processing, the inferencing that needs to be happen parallel what we're going to be doing in the energy space. And so I think partnering up with the health community and what you're seeing with personal health records is greatly going to impact what we do in the energy space. So this is not just a problem for ourselves. These are problems that others have been solving already and other communities are solving. So I think that's an interesting point to keep in mind and piggybacking on those efforts. Lastly, I want to talk about education. So as being a professor, I get the privilege of being able to work with undergraduates and graduate students. And so I think the K through 12 and also the university education system really needs to look at how we can allow students to take advantage of the information that we're enabling. And we're seeing a lot of microgrid sites where universities are building these capabilities on the universities so that they can have students interact with this data. You see dorms that are really instrumented with a lot of these sensors. And I think we're actually seeing a cultural shift in our next generation engineers, entrepreneurs, in that they really start to understand what energy is. I think their mental model is actually spot on in terms of what they need to do, where energy comes from, and I think that's something we need to embrace. I think the education system really will benefit from this. One concrete example is I teach a capstone class at the University of Washington where it's basically a project-based class. 3 years ago, when I taught this capstone class, a lot of the projects that people would come up to me with on getting their approval with would be around entertainment, gaming, those kind of things. And now, more than half, nearly 75% of the hundreds of projects that I actually work with on students are around sustainability and energy. And there's a reason for that, right? This is something that they care about, something that they feel important, and there's a huge change in the cultural thinking at the universities and at the K-12 level, and I think we need to take advantage of that. And I think one of the good examples that we've seen recently is this big initiative called the Green Button, which is allowing individuals to download your energy use data. It might not be high resolution, it might not be perfect, it could be every 15 minutes or every minute, but it's a way to download your energy data and put it into social media applications, visualization tools that universities and other people will be building that allows you to better understand your energy use. And I think more and more of these things need to be built so that the university systems and the K-12 students can start to leverage to build their own solutions around it. So, thanks.
So, Shwetak, thank you, first of all, for that. I wanted to make an observation on this very last point. I was recently talking to some young people. Now, you understand my definition of young keeps changing as I get older, but these folks were in their early 20s. And we were talking about lifespan, and we thought they might have lifespans 80 to 90 years or more. And then we started doing the arithmetic. Let's see, if you were 20 years old now, in 2010, and you live to be 80 years old, that's 60 years from now, that's 2070. That's not very far away from the 22nd century. It's also well past the 2050 period when we think we'll have 9 billion people in the world. As they started to realize the dates, they started to realize that stuff was going to happen over that period of time, the effects of global warming, the problems of water and all the other things. The worry about environment and energy and what life was going to be like during those periods sort of dawned on them. And it was funny that they hadn't done that math before. So there is an understandable shift that you're observing, I think, in part for that reason. Well, G, what can you tell us about this problem space?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. Over the last few days, it's been a lot of excitement around the merge of information, communication systems, and energy. And through that combination, whether it's through monitoring, behavioral shifts and whatnot, being able to achieve some very impressive results in terms of sustainability and energy reduction. And while all of that is true and very exciting, one often overlooked part is the network itself. Now, this is true because from a percentage perspective, from a relative perspective, the network and the communication systems and the data centers and whatnot take up a relatively small fraction of greenhouse gas emissions. But in absolute terms, it's substantial. And in addition to that, when you add more data to these systems, normally, up until this point, over the last 20 years or so, the system has accommodated that by increasing its own efficiency, its spectral efficiency, its data handling capability. But we are very, very close now to the Shannon limit, to the ultimate limit of performance of these systems, whether it's wireless, wireline, optical systems, and whatnot. So this means that the exponential growth of the network traffic, and even beyond that, because of all of these other requirements we're putting on the network, means exponential growth in the power requirements of the network. Because in order to double the network capacity, we now have to double the number of systems, each contributing in the same way from a power requirement. So a few years ago, there was a fundamental study done on thinking about the network from its very basic properties of connectivity and whatnot. And it was discovered that the network, from a theoretical point of view, is operating at about a factor of 1,000 times less efficient than the theoretical limit. So here's an opportunity that we can take advantage of while all of these systems are trying to improve in factors of 10, 20 percentage points on large systems. Here's something that we could achieve factors of 100 fairly easily. And so a few years ago, we created a consortium, a global consortium of over 60 members now, called Green Touch, with the directive to discover and invent technologies that could achieve this. And while we think about, you may not think about how much electricity is used to download the Netflix video or whatnot, and in large parts of the world, over half of the network is actually powered by diesel fuel because of the disruption in the utility grids and whatnot. So here we see an opportunity to really merge the two and have a tremendous amount of impact with still a very, very fruitful area of research.
Thank you. So actually I hadn't realized that the theoretical limit was that far away. That's actually rather encouraging. And now if we're getting molecular computers and other kinds of things, the energy requirements to move photons around is going to be much less. So that's good news. So Anita, you were going to give us a little bit more of a sense of what's it like to be a consumer of all of this information and do something with it. So I will turn the podium over to you.
Very good. Good afternoon. Let me start with some large context. The developed world, society in the developed world, has lived through a succession of technology-based revolutions. For example, it's water, clean water, and sanitation that allowed the average age in the United States to go up from 40 years in about 1900 to, I thought it was in the 70s, but Vince is telling us now 80s. And that's technology. Second example that fits here is electrification. Every person in the U.S., in all of the developed world, is now illuminated. So step back and ask, and the one we're living through now is information technology. And I'll come back to that. How does the end user actually access the fruits of the first two revolutions, the water, sanitation, the electricity? Well, for water, it's the interface is very difficult. You turn on the faucet. You turn it off. You flush to cause another function to happen. With electricity, you plug something into the wall. You flip a light switch. You flip a lamp switch. The interfaces to the access to what's delivered by those revolutions are really simple. But now let's take information technology. The picture is not at all so rosy, because what information technology delivers is information, and the information has got to be absorbed to be useful. It's got to be absorbed by the human brain. Then for information technology to be useful to you, you have to invest yourself into it. You have to decide what you want and how you want it packaged, how much you're going to learn about programming or arcane interfaces of whatever application. That's one reason why information technology is often delivered to you in the form of widgets. So you have game widgets that only do one function. You have mobile phones that do another function, but have a different interface. You have iPods, you have iPads, you have full-blown laptops, and the interfaces are all much messier because it's information that's got to be delivered to the way you think. It's got to be tailored to you, and I'm sorry to say, you've got to do the tailoring. You've got to pick and choose what you want to use, and many people say, I don't want to bother with that. And so they distance themselves from accessing that particular revolution. What we're here to talk about in this summit is the interplay of information technology and energy systems. And saying that another way, you have information technology systems mostly netted together, and they have to interface with what Vint called a long time ago the Internet of Things. Maybe your local net rather than Internet of Things, but it's an Internet of Things. If what you want to do is improve the efficiency of the energy system, you've got all these sensors and you've got all these consumption appliances in your home, in your factory, whatever, or if you're in the generation or T&D business, you're actually generating the asset. And so the interface, again, is quite complicated. You know, you don't just plug something into the wall to get the efficiency. You don't just turn on a spigot. And so one of my first messages is there really are some challenges to try to reap these efficiencies. I was just blown away with the SMART 2020 document that says that information and communications technology ought to be able to deliver carbon savings that are 5 times the total emissions of the ICT sector in the year 2020. Sorry, they should deliver it by 2020. I think it's yes, deliver it by 2020. But there are some real challenges, and the first one is grounded in the complexity of the interface. And so sort of the first message is that if you want to have a confluence of information technology, computing, communication, and the energy systems to try to reap efficiencies, your first challenge is smarts. Because you've got to develop the smarts in the IT system to actually achieve those technologies. And that means models of the energy system. That means models of the environment. And that means models to some extent of the users. And so you have actually 2 challenges. One is the smarts that you put in the automation, in the monitoring, in the control systems, and in the interfaces that you reflect data back to the users, all the way from generation to the home individual user. So it's the smarts and the interface. And that really is a big challenge. Those are not solved issues. They are not something the IT community can just deliver out. There is a good reason why Apple makes incredible profits they deliver some of the best interfaces in the world, and we're willing to pay for it. And you've got to produce that class of interfaces for the energy system if you really want to reap these efficiencies. And I surmise, Shankar and some others are going to be more expert about this, but if you look across the energy world, it seems to me it's a little easier to to do the monitoring and the automation down at the generation end, the beginning, because you have clear models of what you want. You're not optimizing for what some particular person is doing. You're trying to run a business. You're trying to run a utility. Then if you move up the scale to the really big users, so the big data centers, to fabrication plants, to large manufacturing plants, there again, you don't have to count for so much for individual foibles. People can make mistakes, and that can cause anomalies, that can cause dangers. But you have a clear model of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve, good metrics of how to do that. You keep moving up further. Shankar talked some about buildings. Those are still large. You have different regions in the building. You can play energy, asset allocation off from one portion to another. But it strikes me that one of the most challenging is what Shwetak talked about, and that is the home. It's smaller. The electricity bill is a couple $100, some number in $100 a month, and you've got to pay for those efficiencies and get the return out of that value. And you don't have to just optimize for those appliances, the refrigerator, the blender, the coffee maker. You've got to optimize for individual people. You know, in buildings, they mostly go home at night, and so you can play a lot of monitoring and automation games. In the homes, those doggone family members are still there, and the first job of the efficiency automation, the machine learning systems inside the information system, is to optimize for what that family wants. And the cost curves are not high, and so it's a very compressed problem. So first observation, I think, is that the smarts inside, the machine intelligence inside, and the interfaces are a key challenge. And the second one that I'd like to highlight, and the last one I'd like to highlight, is security and privacy. Now, you may have not noticed, but those of us who are computer science and IT product builders haven't actually solved the security problem. You know, we're really not so good. And it's a problem. Wireless is particularly difficult because it's so easy to pick up and monitor, because it's not a wire line. And it's typically not encrypted. You also will have probably noticed that what we used to talk about as computer viruses, information viruses, and worms have jumped the barrier. They can now demonstrably use to target explicit physical devices. I mean, this is like bird flu jumping from being a disease of birds to threatening human beings. The advent of those kind of viruses actually having effect really is a jump in barrier, and that changes the security challenges to incorporating information systems with energy systems. And the second part, there's security on the one hand, security of the systems, security of the energy system, the IT system, but there's also the companion piece of privacy. As I think it was Shwetak that mentioned, that it's natural to partner with health monitoring, especially in the home, because what you're looking at, what you're optimizing for, is how the people are using the energy system, and the same kinds of things you're going to want to observe would relate to, say, monitoring a very elderly person who maintains life in their home, but who might need to send out some alerts from time to time and get some help from time to time. And so the privacy issues, which are sometimes overlooked when people think about reaping energy efficiencies, really can't be overlooked. It's my supposition that we have not seen some crises where the leakage of privacy information has really harmed individuals. People that most freely give out information are young to encounter such situations. I do research in security, so I'm paid to be a pessimist, but I think those kind of things are going to happen. And so as we try to reap efficiencies out of the energy system, from day one, you've got to pay attention to the privacy issues. Thank you.
So those are a powerful set of challenges. I wondered, I was going to say, if the panelists would like to fire off a few questions at each other, that would be perfectly okay. So, Shankar, what is the other one?
I'd like to pick up actually more than 5 questions and a few of the things that Anita said. So I'll just a few more numbers. So buildings, 40% of the energy consumed in the United States is in buildings. 55% commercial buildings, 45% residential. Now, the issues of how you motivate residential consumers is very different, as Anita said. And let me sort of give you some more of the story. For a residential customer, and I'll pick up on this, it's $3,000 square foot, 3,000 square foot home, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. These are the units that they choose to do some of these studies on. And Anita had the numbers. It's about $3,000 a year of heating, HVAC, and lighting bills. It's a little different in different regions depending on the weather. But then you ask yourself, if you were to cut this energy consumption by a half, what sort of capital investment would you need to do, assuming an ROI of 10 years, 3 years, 5 years? Yeah. And the answers are quite often, if you wanted a 10-year ROI, I know these answers, 50% energy reduction in 10 years, and you want to get your money back in 10 years or sooner, it's an additional capital cost of $50,000. So if you then do these behavioral...
Of how much?
$50,000. $50,000 amortized over those 10 years. So you add $50,000 to your mortgage, and you recover that. You recover the costs of the mortgage in 10 years, and
still expensive.
It is expensive. So, and the reason this is all important is there's a lot of talk about net zero homes and what exactly a net zero home means. And when you throw in these numbers, I think some of these things start showing up. However, if you do the behavioral study then, of then asking, would you rather invest in marble countertops or $50,000, the answer unfailingly to date has been marble countertops. and this is a real challenge because it is, and this is a challenge that's encountered by people that want to put solar panels on their roofs. It's encountered by people who want to get HVACs with, and I'm sure a lot of you in this have got multiple zones which you don't know how to program and all of that. But these are some of the behavioral aspects. For commercial buildings, it's even worse. The reason it's even worse for commercial buildings is because the person that builds the building is not the person that operates it, and the person that lives in it has no connection either to the builder or the person that pays the bills. So, when we motivate our students in these dorms that Shwetak talked about, they're doing it for idealistic reasons and out of the goodness of their hearts. Until we find a better linkage between who pays the bills, and also, in fact, the trade-off between the operational cost and the upfront capital costs and the user's costs for owning the space, I think it's very, very hard to get motion. And so, even commercial, and so I'm just nuancing your comment.
Go ahead, Anita.
So somewhere we need to find more investment, because these are, I think I'd probably go get the granite marble top countertops too. But two of us mentioned that there really is a parallelism between the kind of monitoring you would do for health in the home, and I think specifically for aged folk, and the energy monitoring. And so the question arises is, who is going to go explore that? Because it's not just a research question, although there's some research you can do on that. But it would be useful to have, I can't see the electric utilities saying that's an important thing to do. Getting DOE and NIH to talk, we could try to do that. But somebody should be asking this question because it's a way to inject some more capital into the sensor and automation and control environment.
I guess.
But honestly, I don't think that that's enough, quite frankly, because, I mean, when you take a look at anything that requires a large behavioral shift, seat belts, not smoking, you know, these things take decades to really do it. And so when you rely on consumers to do this, that's a very hard, long road. But businesses who have operational expense, where these things come in very clearly, who every day make the ROI investment decisions all the time, you have a natural advantage, whether it's through their communication infrastructure, whether it's through their residential buildings and things that you don't see in the kind of regular population.
So I wonder.
I guess another way to think about that is I totally agree. I think there are more low-hanging fruits where we can have an impact sooner. But I would argue that you obviously don't want to shy away from the residential because this 10, 15 year outlook on making a difference is something that we want to tackle, but it's harder, right? And so we should start sooner rather than later. But the other, kind of going back to Anita's point, is who would do this, where you have two seemingly very different areas, and who would actually combine the two? And it's a hard question, but there are a lot of parallels, like I said, on the technology side, even on the business model side, right? Because you're saying, well, who pays? Well, in the health industry, who pays? Right, you have the health care provider, you have the hospital, you have the insurance company, you have the person themselves. There's a similar kind of parallel there too.
But I didn't want to be totally pessimistic about the business model because there is, SAIC, which GE does something about, is an example of something that has a business model called ESCOs. ESCOs, Energy Systems. I forgot what the ESCO stands for. And their business model is that they'll provide the upfront capital for reaping these energy savings. And certainly Johnson & Johnson, Honeywell, all the major players are in the ESCO business. So there is, the criticism, I think, that is made of ESCOs is a small meal, and really what we're looking for is big shifts. And is there enough of a profit in the ESCO business to really get, and so I'm with G in that, if you want to move faster than 10 years, you've got to make it a little more profitable for ESCOs. And
to kind of finish up the point that I was trying to make, which was, who would actually bring together these two areas? I think there's a couple of things that the IT revolution actually is giving us. One is, you have these boxes in your home, right? Be it a cable box, be it a router. So you already have this gateway, you can call it. And this gateway can offer a variety of different services, right? I mean, you can run its own operating system, the home operating system, whatever you want to call it, where it can give you these services in terms of energy sustainability reports, but also kind of home health monitoring. And there's a handful of companies that are seizing that opportunity. For example, ADT at one point started to offer an elder care service. Well, why is ADT doing this? Well, ADT is doing it because they have so many motion sensors around a house. And why not piggyback on that infrastructure? Verizon, Comcast are starting to offer home management or home monitoring services where you can start to sneak that in as well. So I think you have an opportunity because the way that the information technology is becoming, this gateway type service providing entity, I think you can start to leverage that. And I think more and more companies will see the benefit of, offering energy services and sustainability services. At the end of the day, if you think about it, sustainability is much broader than what we think of, right? Sustainability is not just energy. Sustainability is health, the planet itself, and energy. So sustainability is actually under, it's a larger umbrella than what we usually
it's a whole ecosystem.
Yeah,
basically.
exactly.
Anita, you had your hand up a moment ago? No. Okay. So I'm not going to let you ask questions yet because I have a bunch of them and I can't stand it anymore. First observation on the sensory side of things, Shwetak, I'm imagining this avalanche of information pouring in somewhere. And I was reminded, as I was imagining all this data being collected, of what I learned the other day about the Google self-driving cars, something I didn't understand. I thought they were autonomous. I was wrong about that. There is a boatload of information coming from every one of those cars, and it's being accumulated in the cloud, and that information is being used to help the car figure out what it's seeing. because cars and the ones that have been driving around in San Francisco have been accumulating information about what San Francisco looks like for quite a while now, which means they can tell that this is a tree and don't wait for it to cross the street because it's been there for the last 5 or 6 years and it's not going to do anything. So the idea of what's ephemeral and what is not builds up over time. The consequence of this is that the car, while it's sensing all this stuff, is sharing that information, and the processing that's going on is analyzing it. So now I'm imagining for a moment that I'm collecting all this information about energy usage. I'm collecting information possibly from the appliances themselves. I can analyze what that particular household, for example, is doing, how it's behaving in terms of energy consumption. When does it consume? What did it consume it with? But I can also be analyzing things about the behavior, comparative behavior with the rest of the data that's been accumulated. So I'm imagining for a moment to come now to your point earlier about conveying information to people in a useful way. Anita, imagine for a moment that you could get advice saying, here's what you've been doing, and here's how much energy you've consumed. This is why your bill was this much. You are, X percentage higher than everybody else in the neighborhood. If you did the following things, your bill would come down. Would you like me to adjust the way in which your appliances consume electricity in order to meet that? Do you have a budget? Are you concerned about how much you spend on energy? If you tell me what that's about, I will try to suggest to you ways in which you could change the way your energy consumption reflects things. And now we get past electricity, because several of us have pointed out that all kinds of things could be monitored, analyzed, measured, whether it's water consumption or other consumables, or the state of our health, or whether we're moving around. Is anybody home? All of those pieces of information could go into an evaluation of the ecology that we're living in. So I get very excited about the possibility of using the cloud computing capability to make better use of our resources.
If I could play back what you said with this, so again in this energy business, there's model-based computing where, so for buildings, or there's this Energy Star, which is Energy Plus, is the simulation package which DOE2 grew into. So that's what simulates structures in the cloud. But then it's never accurate enough because it depends on features which are impossible to model, just like your Google car. So then you use sensor information to add a data-driven component with learning, with the kinds of techniques that Shwetak talked about. And so I think what's exciting here that the information technology has brought is sort of swarms on the one hand, clouds on the other hand, and we're intermediating sort of data from all of this swarm to actually influence the kinds of computations that you do on the cloud, and actually then using the handheld devices to give people, a personal stake in making these decisions. And I know Anita's waiting to jump in here, but I think that the interfaces to be customized would then translate into, quote, apps on these handheld devices, because we're better off leaving the swarms to be diverse and the cloud computing to be sort of the cloud computing the way we know it. And so even in the user interfaces, maybe it sort of plays into the app business and the smartphone business, but then, and I'm not disputing the fact that these apps do need to be built to be customizable. But in some ways, it feels more hopeful somehow.
Anita?
Let me make somewhat of the same point in a very different way. What you're proposing, Vint, let's see, we don't need to talk about it in terms of how the technology delivers it, but the root of what you suggested is going from an instantaneous snapshot of what the system looks like now to having an entire history of what it was or what it could be, and comparing the very recent history against that and making intelligent decisions. I've spent a lot of my time in the national security community, and they made a huge jump when they went from trying to understand an instantaneous snapshot from the theater. Say if you have a military troop in some theater, from saying, oh, no, that's just the instantaneous snapshot. Let's compare it to the history, either the last day or the same thing that happened this hour each of the last umpteen days before. And when you jump from processing the instantaneous image to having the knowledge that's there in the history, I mean, you've leaped over tall buildings in a single bound. So that's the way, and that's, I think, the way to think about it, not to think about the technology that delivers it. It's going from an instantaneous snapshot to history in comparison to that snapshot.
So one question for G and an observation about your point. Someone showed me on the plane flying up to Boston a couple of days ago a little application on his mobile that showed his weight, which he was tracking every day. And it turned out that this was actually had a very positive feedback effect, because as it was going down, it gave him motivation to keep going, and when it went up, it gave him even more motivation to not do whatever it was that he just ate. This feedback loop and the information over time and how am I doing, I think, is a really powerful thing. Now, in terms of incentives, which G brought up, at what point do building codes begin to drive us towards more efficient buildings, more instrumented buildings, and so on? What would cause the building code to change, and who would have to decide that in order to enable an infrastructure that does the kinds of things that Shwetak and Anita and Shankar are talking about? Who actually gets to say the building should be built this way because it's beneficial for everybody?
So actually there's also another app, as you saw on maybe the Super Bowl commercial, with the 3 young girls also feeding back on how your weight is doing as well. So it's YouTube is a good thing for that. Look, when we think about who decides these things, it really is a matter of if it's locally good. It's a good business investment for me. It should be my decision, because I will act on it much faster than waiting for a regulatory decision to come down.
Okay.
Regulatory decisions are really are best served when there's an external cost that I'm not including in my analysis. So from a social good, it's better for everyone to do it, to maybe increase the level of scaling, pricing, and whatnot, drive down costs, those kind of incentives. So when you take a look at something like the airplane trip that you took, and look at the airplane industry, you struggle to get 10, 15, 20% fuel efficiency and things like that. But when, as Anita pointed out with the Smart 2020 report, the ICT industry is within a factor of 3 from the airline industry. So as you can start to ride the electronics and technology curve that Bill pointed out earlier, you can start to make substantial gains in these areas that are kind of ripe and easy to do.
So you mentioned the seatbelt, and I just wanted to notice that the reason that people wear seatbelts is they get fines if they're caught not wearing them. So regulatory things are sometimes necessary. I see we have a queue building up here. If you'll forgive me, I have one more question to ask, and then we'll go into Q&A here from the floor. I want to find it was a particularly interesting part. Oh, okay. This had to do with the specificity of attack vectors. You mentioned Stuxnet, for example, as a very precise and targeted worm or virus. I'm noticing that this is also showing up in the email world with spear phishing. So the level of spam is actually coming down. There's still a lot of it, but the spammers are not finding as much benefit from sending out large amounts of email. They're finding the better benefit spear phishing people. And of course, it's also the way in which some of the really egregious industrial espionage attacks begin, with the spear phishing message that leads somebody to ingest a keylogger and lose passwords and things like that. So I think we are facing a much more sophisticated environment now than we ever had before, and that just makes it all a lot harder. Well, I think we ought to try to take some questions from the floor. Let me also ask our Twitter feed expert to bring his laptop up. He's going to be showing me the tweets that have come in. While you're doing that, let me get the first question. Could you also say who you are? Yes, thanks. Bring the lights up. Could you say who you are, and then please ask the question that you have.
Thank you. My name's Dave Watson with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I do have a question, but first I want to respond to one of the comments up there about who decides on building codes. And I, as a lab researcher, have been intimately involved in that. In California, Title 24 Energy Code is quite aggressive, and it's known worldwide. So in 2008, we became aware that one vendor offered a control system that already listened for remote signals to come in and modulate the power on the whole building. But no one really knew about it, even their salespeople. And it was rarely used until the researchers kind of discovered this feature and started using it for remote controlled demand response. In the Title 24 hearings, people would argue for hours about the thickness of window panes and insulation and cost paybacks and all this sort of thing. I simply got up there and said, this one is free. Somebody's already doing it for free, and no one even knows about it, and it has all these benefits. There's virtually no incremental cost if we do it a few years from now in code, and it went through like a slam dunk in 2008. Now the hooks we're in, 2013 is going to get even more aggressive. It's going to be a national standard that we've been working on in some of the NIST activities. So I guess my comment would be, it's not the funnest thing to do to sit through those code hearings, but I believe it's very important, and I encourage everyone to do it because it really will make a large impact. And look at California's Title 24 Energy Code as an example. And here's my question to Vint.
Yeah.
When's IPv6 going to be ready? And I mean, I know it's ready, but when's it going to be widely used? We need it. We're going to run out, huh? Run out of addresses.
Okay, so would the panel like to respond to this?
I think it was addressed to you.
Well, so that's a problem for me because I heard about every third word. So I'm sorry about the long speech. You want to rephrase it?
He wants to know when IPv6 is available.
Okay, so all right. So first of all, you understand we ran out in February of last year of the IPv4 address space. Bob Kahn and I thought that 4.3 billion terminations was enough for an experiment. That was in 1973, and the experiment lasted for quite a long time, and then we ran out. So, first of all, I'm a huge proponent of getting IPv6 out there. It takes care of the Internet of Things and large numbers of devices. Moreover, it avoids having network address translation boxes, which are a weak spot in the architecture. It wrecks end-to-end security and everything else. So, on June 6th this year, there will be a launch of IPv6 by all of the ISPs and the end suppliers like Google and others of IPv6 capability. We're going to leave it on. So that's basically IPv6 launch day is June 6, 2012. Not everyone will be turning it on. Not every ISP is capable of it yet. Most edge devices can do it. Almost all the laptops and desktops and so on. LTE, the next generation of mobiles, is based on IPv6. So I'm actually hopeful that we will see more than the very, very tiny penetration of IPv6 so far. The reason that people haven't implemented it up until now is that they haven't been confronted with running out of IPv4 address space. And some of the ISPs have been leaning on network address translation as a substitute for spreading. But even that has limits. So I'm a huge fan of trying to get V6 out there. I think if we don't do it, the Internet won't be able to grow very much. All right, next question. Oh, I'm sorry. Do we have a tweet? We have a tweet.
From
hang on. I'm going to try to alternate back and forth between tweets on the net and the live microphone. This tweet says, how can open source and public license efforts best support this energy and information revolution? How can open source and public license? I'm not sure what a public license means. Anybody know what that is? I don't know what a public license is. Is that you mean by licensing of the software, making it accessible like Creative Commons or?
Exactly.
Okay, good. So can that help?
Yeah, I think it certainly can play a huge role. It's just how I was talking about how, in terms of making all these projects available and the data available for high school and undergraduate students and even grad students, I think having people, just how a lot of the open source software has evolved over time, where you had a lot of really smart people working on these platforms. I think this is one way to solve the energy problem, is you could actually offer a lot of these platforms and data available so that people can start to work on it, right? And I think that's one way to do it, because right now there isn't really a common data set or anything that we could leverage. But I think making that available just reduces the barrier for somebody to actually do something in this space.
So Anita and then Shankar.
Let's see. There's another thing that another accessibility thing that could help, and that is if the government, in its exploration of energy efficiency, I'm talking about Henry Kelly's office now in DOE, makes available the models that they use and the data that they get back from their test beds, so there's not a privacy issue. That would be complementary to open source and would allow for yet more capstone courses, projects.
Okay.
So I want to respond to this. Open source and public license is a slightly different domain. President Clinton talked this morning about biofuels for 50% of the Navy planes, and which is a wonderful goal by the Navy. So, certainly what's emerging in synthetic biology is really, so of which biofuels are the piece, is really an attempt at bringing the methods of electronic design automation, EDA, VLSI design, and then sort of the architecture of computer systems to biological systems. And I think it's a subject of really pretty intense debate, because the community, the biological community that has thus far been used to much more proprietary data, really needs to step up. In my opinion, it's very much like in the computer industry, like in the IC industry. Yeah. It was critical to make the design tools open. I think what you did with them can be as proprietary as you want to make money. But I think that so for instance, SPICE, Simulation Program for Integrated Circuit Analysis, there's a counterpart of it called BioSPICE, which is Simulation Program for Intracellular Evaluation, and then there's BioCAD and so on and so forth. So the issues of really making these tools available to everybody, I think, will be critical for deciding where we go with synthetic biology. And by the way, synthetic biology is not a boutique technology. And we talked about this 40% in buildings and 25% in transportation. The rest is the energy consumption in industry. And a lot of that energy consumption in industry is around specialty chemicals, around chemicals. And really there, the potential of synthetic biology is to revolutionize how you build those molecules. And so I think that how open source plays out in that context is going to be hugely important.
We certainly have seen what's happened when you have open platforms like the apps on the mobiles. An incredible amount of creativity is unleashed because all the details are taken care of as long as you meet the right interface spec. Now, thank you for waiting. Now you can ask your question.
Chun Changpyeol from Daikin Industry, Japan. We are globally a major HVAC system manufacturer. And I understand the argument, if you link all the air conditioning systems, you can save some energy. And I also understand, we also come to the conclusion, people will pick the countertop rather than the smart air conditioner. So I think we need to provide some extra value, just saving energy. So I want to ask each of you, the expert of IT technology, what kind of extra value you can provide? Why I need my refrigerator to be connected to the internet? Why my air conditioner to do? I want to do that. What give me any reason about that kind of thing. Thank you.
Okay, so once again, I wasn't able to hear all of that question. So do we have an answer from the panel?
So the question was, how can you build extra services or capabilities to motivate somebody to pick the smart refrigerator or the smart HVAC system over the granite countertop or whatever? And I guess one way to respond to that is, we struggle with this, and I struggle with this in the research that I do. But one concrete example is, so I also do work in, monitoring energy use, but also water use. And so a lot of times people say, well, water, I don't really spend a lot of money on water. But it turns out it actually is a lot. It's water plus the sewage that you have to pay for as well. But there are other incentives that people people are interested in, despite money, in addition to money, which is, kind of safety and other things like peace of mind. So for water, one of the things we say is, not only this gives you an opportunity to, manage your water use and give you feedback on that, but it can alert you when a leak happens. Well, when you tell somebody, oh, okay, a leak is going to happen, well, then they get really excited because either they themselves or one of their friends or a loved one have had a story where a major catastrophic leak happened and it set them back, thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. And so I think the incentive models definitely have to be there. And I think the kind of technology we're thinking about here actually has a lot of implications beyond just energy. So I think you're right. Those are the things that we definitely need to think about. And I think that's work that a lot of folks in industry are also looking at.
So I'm going to argue that we could take advantage of the comment that Anita made earlier about good quality user interfaces driving people to want certain kinds of things because they're easy to use and they're flexible and you keep expanding their functionality. When you have devices that you depend on every day and you're able to manage them somehow, either know about their state or, in my case, I worry about the cooling temperature in the wine cellar, and I'm always nervous that it's going to start heating up when I'm away. Peace of mind comes from getting the little note every 5 minutes saying your wine is okay, it's still at 62 degrees. So, your mileage might vary, but the point here is that once you create applications that other people show excitement about because it's helping them either be more efficient or feel more safe or feel more comfortable, then you start to drive interest in getting appliances that have those kinds of capabilities. Let me get the next question.
Let me just add one extra point.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Gene.
In addition to the financial incentives that we spoke about, there's been a very successful and popular program here in the United States called Energy Star that shows exactly how much you're using for any given appliance. That may inform you as an individual on any particular purchase, and you can choose to make that trade-off yourself. But what it does from an industry perspective is now competition starts to happen around Energy Star. So Energy Star becomes a norm, and then you go relative. So the simple fact of inserting something like this into the industry, even though it may not affect your specific or individual transaction, can have a huge effect on the industry. And this is, common with sleep modes in routers or open source stacks and things like this. By inserting it into the industry itself, you can have this broad effect.
I wonder whether that kind of information, if we're accumulating it, would allow municipalities to make decisions about how well or poorly their populations are doing with regard to consumption of resources, or regional. And it's all of this is information that helps us understand how we're doing and maybe help us motivate to do better. Let me get one more Twitter feed and then we'll come on the floor again. What are the similarities and differences between routing data on the internet and power on the grid? I would like to make one observation and then the panel will probably want to jump in here. There's an interesting parallel between circuit switching and the current power generation system and packet switching and what the power generation and distribution system could be. In a circuit switch system, since there's no memory, it's necessary that both ends be transmitting and receiving at exactly the same rate because there's no place to store any difference. In the power generation system of today, you must generate exactly as much power as is now demanded. And the problem is maintaining the generation level so that it matches demand, which of course is fluctuating. In the packet switching world, storage allows you to have different speeds at the ends of the net. I can have a gigabit guy on one end and a kilobit guy on the other end. Now, plainly, the gigabit guy will overload the kilobit guy, even though there's storage in the net to deal with the variation. So you have to have flow control in addition to having storage. But the storage allows you to do this speed mismatching. What we don't have right now is power storage that lets us do the moral equivalent of packet switching. But when you have episodic sources of power generation, the ability to store power and make it available when you're not generating it is the moral equivalent of store and forward packet switching. Now, I don't know whether the panel would like to add to that, but that's a very powerful metaphor for me.
I'd like to pick up on this. So I think Vint got it right. I think that if you do have reliable distributed storage, then I think it makes a lot of sense to move away from a circuit switch model where supply and demand have to be exactly equal at every time instant. So I think the current power system has been built to be circuit switched because of lots of considerations about reliability, which said that you wanted to be sure with 6 nines or 8 nines or some very, very large number of nines, probability that, when you flipped on the switches, you flipped on the circuits. Now, I do think that the battery technology is key, but I also feel the battery technology is making progress. Mm-hmm. And given that that is the case, I think that in the long run, there is really there is no option but to have distributed storage to intermediate intermittent sources of clean power and widely variable consumption, and in addition to be then able to price based on quality of service, because it all goes together, and not all consumption is the same, even though in today's model all consumption is treated exactly identical. So I think that the transition from the current power grid to the smart grid is to bring in exactly the elements that Vint talked about.
Okay, let's get
Can I just add one extra thing to that? Because I think there's another huge difference between the two. One is an analog system, and one is a digital.
Yes.
And on the digital system, you can apply digital signal processing that allows you to operate at very different levels than on an analog system.
That's a very good point.
And also the other thing is error correction, right? You can do error correction.
Exactly.
If you could do error correction on the grid, that would be amazing.
Exactly.
All right, let's get a question here, and then we'll get a question over the other microphone. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. My name is Ram Sastry. I'm from Patel. My question is to Professor Sastry and Professor Patel. For those of us on the field who have to demonstrate immediate ROI by keeping capital expenses low, so my question is this to the two applications both of you discussed. By keeping instrumentation costs low, that is number of sensors low, is there a better way of controlling a building, controlling the energy usage? By that I mean controlling your HVAC systems, using daylight when possible, things of that sort, taking into account weather, pre-cooling, preheating, using predictive control, sophisticated predictive control. And can these algorithms be implemented on real building automation systems every 5 minutes in response to grid signals, for example, or pricing signals? And same question similar to you, Professor Patel. When we're talking about providing disaggregated energy use feedback to consumers, again, one can instrument the heck out of a building and get that information, but if you have to do that in a very smart way using a smart meter that provides you 15-minute resolution, how far can you push this? To what extent can you disaggregate using the smartest algorithms available to give you fine-grained disaggregation? That would be a terrific ROI because there's not much instrumentation cost involved, but you're providing great value by providing smarter algorithms. Thank you very much.
So I think for the building story, I believe that the kind of sensing that's needed is pretty rudimentary. Consider putting a radio on every thermostat. And I think with CFLs, you're going to have a radio on every light bulb. And
thank God for IPv6. You know that there's already an IPv6 enabled light bulb.
Yes, there certainly is. So I think that the incremental cost of getting the radios on these is not super high today, but it'll really drop as these radios get integrated into all of the... And by the way, in the average modern building, there's already a huge amount of distributed data that you collect and you actually maroon for a variety of reasons, including not having the IPv6 cranked up to be able to use the information. But so I don't think there's a lot of extra instrumentation. Furthermore, I think the kinds of computations that you do need, and some of it does need to be done in the cloud, but I think there's a lot of computational power on smartphones which can actually be brought to bear on being able to control the environment of a building. So in a couple of floors of one of the buildings in Berkeley, we allow individual students' smartphones to actually control both the lighting and the HVAC of the buildings. And the phones just talk to the radios that are installed on the different thermostats inside the building. And the only, when you talk about HVAC, you think that you'd like to measure flows and all of that. But I think the only things you need to measure are the temperatures of different zones. You don't need to measure occupancies. You don't need passive infrareds, which is, you can estimate all of this. And I guess that's a version of the kind of disaggregation that Shwetak talks about from rather rudimentary sensors. So I don't think it's the cost of the sensing. It's really to make sure, as Anita said, people have an incentive to want to interact with the phones in attractive enough ways, and then to provide the economic incentives to go along with it.
And then on the residential side, as you mentioned, having a 15-minute meter data is really hard to work with. Obviously, if you don't have any, it's a sparse sampling problem. If you don't have any samples there, how can you even estimate it? And so I think there's a middle ground here. And the things that I've been advocating is you can, instead of doing a distributed sensor, you can actually have a single or a very small number of sensors that are pretty sophisticated. They give you more information, more data about the signal source you're trying to detect. If you could actually have a meter that gave you, second by second or cycle by cycle information, plus all this other harmonic information, noise over the power line, high frequency noise that's in the voltage domain, all these other features, that will give you a lot more information with still a very sparse sensor deployment, right? It's one device that's in your house. It's a lot more intelligent. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And on the other side, which you were alluding to, is if you're going to do actuation, if you're going to actuate everything in your home anyway, why not just have a distributed sensor network deployed if you're going to have to put actuators everywhere? I guess one way to kind of combat that is if you have really high resolution sensor information and able to tease apart people's energy use, you can actually start to make actionable suggestions about what kinds of actuators do you need to install. I think that's something that's kind of missing here, is that you can start to educate people about these are the 4 things that you really need to work on, and you can use 2 actuators. One is the human themselves through behavior change, and secondly, tailor the feedback so that you actually put the right actuators in there rather than taking a shot in the dark. And I think that's the strategy that you can have, which is a nice intermediate solution.
There's a project that I visited while I was up in Boston and Cambridge yesterday at the MIT Media Lab. It is a highly instrumented building. Their own Media Lab building has been extraordinarily instrumented, and they are capturing all kinds of information in real time. They're projecting it into 3 space. If you want to go to or search, do a Google search that says Doppel Lab, like doppelganger, DOPPELLAB. I believe you'll find an example of what they can do. It's all web-based. And I found it pretty intriguing about what you can do with a lot of information coming in about what's happening in a building. Okay, let me get the gentleman over here who's waited patiently.
David Karabalnikov with the Institute for Village Resiliency. I was curious in terms of, in my automobile.
I'm not going to be able to hear you no matter what, but I'm hoping that the panel can, and I'm not sure they can either. You might want to speak up.
No, I might just have a low voice. In my automobile, I have, instantaneous feedback information. I know my speed, and I know how much fuel I have total. I don't have any equivalent of that in a building. You just get a bill at the end of the month. And so what kind of inexpensive technologies can be used just to give instantaneous feedback about energy consumption and how the user can change their behavior according to that, just like with the fuelage sensors that are coming out now for cars?
So the sort of dashboards of the kind that you're talking about for cars, I think there are attempts at pulling this together for building occupants, which has lighting usage, HVAC usage. I don't think it's per person; it's for regions. And just like the Doppel Lab that he talked about, there's a version of this at Berkeley as well, where there are downloadable apps on smartphones which give you this sort of dashboard. Of course, how these dashboards get customized will depend on the uses that people make of them. And having open interfaces actually gives people a chance to innovate around them. So I think that's beginning to show up, the kind of Prius-like data that you have on cars is showing up.
Okay, let me get the last. Oh, I'm sorry, Anita, you wanted to respond.
When you have a car under your control, you can take very rapid action against what you see on the dashboard. I think if you ask for instantaneous data in the home, you have to first ask the question of, can you really make use of it in that kind of time frame? What am I going to do? I'm going to close a window, or I'm going to lower a shade, and then it will take a long time for temperature to equalize. And so when one asks for data, I think you want to ask for it in a way that is consistent with what you might do with it. And so I'm not sure instantaneous, I'd have to think about it, but I'm not sure that's what I'd want.
15 minutes.
Okay, last question.
Hi, Sylvain Bruni from Aptima in Boston. I work in the field of adapting technology to human behavior, and hearing what you've been saying, I mean, this is music to my ears, seeing how we can optimize the design of the system so that it really tailors to what the humans are doing. But I'm hearing a lot of challenges on your end that I think are already being addressed in terms of being able to detect behavioral patterns from humans, and being one step further, being able to predict what people are going to be doing, being able to design interfaces and automation for decision support systems for all of this. We have some initiatives working with the University of Connecticut defining some of those concepts. We're doing it for the Department of Defense, and I'm trying to understand, what needs to happen to make it happen in this field? What is the main hurdle into getting this to really happen? Is it looking at the sub-metering equipment that you've been talking about a little bit? Is it the security and privacy concern? You're getting a cultural shift for the consumers to be able to, allow the system to monitor them and being able to draw inference on what they do and then act upon that? Is it, about all the energy storage issues? What are the key things that we really need to be able to solve so that then we can input the human information into the system?
Do we have a response from the panel?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I guess my response would be it's all of the above, unfortunately. Because it's going to be the security privacy considerations, it's going to be the HCI questions behind it and what data you get. You can just think about it. If you look at the last 40, 50 years of how you get energy feedback back in the home is through a bill, which comes every 30 days, which has pretty esoteric information on it, right? And so I think that's a big change in what we're getting now and what we've been getting for the last 40 years or more. And so I think there's going to be a huge cultural change in addition to a lot of these security privacy challenges, but also how do we get the data in the first place? So unfortunately, there isn't one way of solving that, and that's what makes this an exciting area. Is I think you can tackle these from different perspectives, and I think you'll start to make progress no matter what.
That'll have to be the last word. We're out of time. But thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking the panel for this afternoon's session.